Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CoSM Podcast. I'm your host, Tyler James Berger. In this episode, I have a brilliant discussion with Lisa Marchiano, Jungian psychoanalyst and co-host of the podcast, This Jungian Life. Our conversation unpacks Carl Jung's ideas on the Anima and Animus, the masculine and feminine energies of the human psyche. Enjoy. All right, I'm here with Lisa Marchiano. Lisa, thank you so much for coming onto the CoSM Podcast. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to kind of exploring some of Carl Jung's ideas around the Anima Anonymous. So how would you define Jung's idea of the Anima and Animus and what functions they serve and how they manifest in an individual psyche?
Well, Jung said that we each have the contrasexual other within us, so that all men have an inner sort of feminine energy and all women have an inner masculine energy. And remember that Jung was coming up with these ideas, probably first it was occurring to him right around, let's say, 1914 or so, thereabouts. So this was, over a century ago, and our understanding of the relationships between the sexes was a little different. So there can be a way that this idea can sound a little antiquated, but I still think that there's some psychological validity to it. Sometimes it's easier when talking about this, when I might bring this into a session, instead of using the terms masculine and feminine, which are so dubious in some way and loaded in other ways. I might just say simply yin and yang. It's this idea of the opposites. Jung said that life proceeds according to pairs of opposites. And I think there's something fundamentally true about that. It's the tension between this thing and this other thing that makes psyche move. And so we each have these opposites within us. And you can think about it as the masculine or feminine. I do think that it often shows up in those terms, not always, but often it shows up for men as the figure of a woman, and often for women it shows up as the figure of a man. And this makes a lot of sense in a way because the biological sexes are kind of the quintessential opposite that our bodies are born kind of knowing about unconsciously, if you think about it. I mean, we're wired as a species to be attuned to members of the opposite sex because, hey, that's how we manage to further the species.
Yeah.
So there is something about it that's really deep in the psyche.
So yeah, and it comes down to that always ever present nature or nurture dynamic. There could be some kind of nurture in terms of what our societal conceptions of male and female are. But of course, there seems to be, he called the Anima and Animus primordial images, that it's like that they have a deep kind of evolutionary basis in our consciousness.
Yeah, I think you're really lifting up one of the things that makes it so tricky is because if we start talking about what is the feminine, well, it's receptive, it's relational, it's the implicit, it's the moon rather than the sun. It's all these things, and you're like, okay, but aren't we kind of treading into sexual stereotypes? And I, it's like, how do you unpick that? Yeah, there's something that's there's a fundamental difference between male and female. Even if you just think about our roles in reproduction, those are there is a difference.
Yeah.
One is penetrating and the other is, receptive. Okay. There's that. But then does that necessarily determine how we are out in the world? What does that mean about our personalities? Certainly, we don't want to be limited by our sex. That shouldn't have anything to say about our personalities or anything like that. So then when you map on this Jungian notion of the feminine and the masculine, it's a little tricky to know, well, when are we talking about stereotypes and when are we talking about something primordial and hardwired.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems it's important to make the distinction almost between uh, male and female and masculine and feminine.
Yeah.
One has more of like a symbolic nature, symbolically masculine and symbolically feminine.
I think that's a perfect way to think about it.
Mm.
And the truth is that you can be female and have a lot of masculine energy in the symbolic sense.
Mm-hmm.
And you can be male and have a lot of feminine energy in the symbolic sense.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, the majority of us have grown up with a mother and a father, and the parental archetypes are really kind of ever present in our developmental stages. And many psychologists have made the observation that the way you speak to your child becomes their inner voice. This
Mm.
idea that the voice of our parents becomes internalized and then expressed as part of our conscience or intuition.
Mm-hmm.
So my question is, how much of the anima or animus is the internalization of the voice of the parent of the opposite gender?
Yeah. That's a great question. It is certainly true that the opposite sex parent will shape the nature of the anima or animus.
Mm.
And let's sort of think about an example here. If you have a very harsh, exacting, critical father, you may develop as a woman, let's say, you may develop an animus that feels um, kind of elusive and critical and difficult to kind of have a relationship with, and what that might look like. So let's talk about what an animus would look like in the psyche of a woman, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So first of all, that energy might show up in dreams. Uh, you might be a woman who has frequent dreams about a male figure who's always just out of reach or is critical or rejecting. I mean, this really happens, right?
Mm-hmm.
That will probably also show up in your life as, if you're heterosexual and you're trying to establish a relationship with a man, you may find that you wind up with men who are somewhat rejecting or cold or critical.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's happening both kind of in the outer world, it's happening in the inner world, and it is often directly related to to the nature of the wound with the opposite sex parent,
Mm.
if there was one.
Yeah, interesting, because you also will hear the observation that kind of we seek out in our partners certain aspects that were present in our parent of the opposite sex.
Mm-hmm.
And, there's an interesting, again, this polarity here between the nurture aspect of the anima and animus and the nature aspect, where,
Mm-hmm.
is it that we have this kind of innate structure to the anima or animus, and we're looking externally for a partner that fits that stencil?
Mm-hmm.
Or are we kind of constructing it kind of as we go and looking for something that fits uh, the the constructed kind of dynamic, whether it was
Mm-hmm.
constructed in our childhood or kind of even throughout our developmental stages?
Mm-hmm. And of course, this idea doesn't just exist in Jungian psychology. The idea that our primary relationships will then have an influence on our romantic partnerships later. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
this is, you see versions of this in Freudian thought, and then, of course, in attachment theory. So there does seem to be something here, really, on the nurture side of things,
Mm-hmm.
that how we are with our primary caregivers as children will set our expectations for later relationships.
Mm-hmm.
What a Jungian frame does is introduces this idea of this archetypal presence. So we come into the world with a sort of ready to receive the pattern of father.
Mm-hmm.
And that would be an archetypal stance. And then that father pattern that's kind of empty of content gets mediated and humanized through interactions with our personal father. And so
Mm-hmm.
it takes on a particular form, which then influences this this other archetype of the animus. And so
Mm-hmm.
Jung would say, yes, the animus is a distinct archetype. So I mentioned that it can show up in dreams. I mentioned that it can show up in outer relationships, but the anima and animus are more than that, though, because they often serve as a kind of guide to the inner world.
Mm-hmm.
This was one of Jung's observation about the anima in particular, but I very much see this with women that I work with in my practice, especially women who are creative, that oftentimes they will have an inner masculine figure. Sometimes it's like an ex-boyfriend from 20 years ago, and he'll show up in the psyche when she's beginning to create. Say if it's a sort of positive figure, she might have these dreams, relatively positive dreams of seeing this person or being with this person, and then, lo and behold, that week she cranks out another short story or something like
Mm-hmm.
that. And you can
Mm-hmm.
really track this
Hmm.
in the unconscious, that a woman's access to her creativity appears to be mediated by the animus.
Hmm. That's interesting because I would generally consider creativity to be a very symbolically feminine act. Feminine in that it is what gives birth to new things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's this seemingly, and I know the root for anima and animus is the same for like animate. Jung thought
Yes.
this was like the animating force.
Yes.
So perhaps that kind of animus in the woman is kind of animates her into a creative state.
Well, I think you raise a good point. And if you think about it as creativity is giving birth to something new, then if you're a woman, you need a man, don't you? I mean,
Mm,
to actually, conceive of new life. So in that sense,
yeah.
it really makes sense that when you're in a creative process as a woman, that the opposite energy shows up in the unconscious as you're
Mm.
as you're conceiving something, some new creative life.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm curious as to what kind of environmental factors affect the expression of the anima or animus, because a few years back, I was a preschool teacher,
Hmm.
right? And this job very much so brought out the feminine aspects of my personality. Feminine in that I really needed to be empathic and nurturing and agreeable and
Hmm.
responding to the needs of these young children. And so that was in some sense the anima coming forward into my persona.
Hmm.
And I'm just imagining maybe a woman who is in a corporate law firm with a bunch of other men. Maybe the animus would need to come out because the selective pressure of the environment is calling for that more masculine element of her personality. I'm wondering if environmental factors affect expressions of the Anima Anonymous.
Yeah, I think that they probably do. And one of the things that Jung says is that, kind of the goal is to explore as much of ourselves as possible and to develop as much of ourselves as possible. So if we've been fairly traditional, whatever that means, as a woman, and then the environment offers us the opportunity to give expression to these other aspects of ourselves, it might feel very foreign and difficult and even disorienting. But the growth that we'll experience from that will be tremendous. So I'm wondering for you, what did you notice about having to try to inhabit these more feminine aspects? What was that like?
I could say that it seemed less like I had to learn these things and more so that I had to realize them.
Yeah.
Whereas almost like when you're around children, they are really just like calling a different part of yourself, like out of your being.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of made me really feel like it was something that was innate in me that was being called out rather than like a set of approaches or behaviors that I had to learn.
Yeah, it was all there. And
Yeah.
did you feel that there were kind of global changes to your personality as a result of integrating that further?
Hmm. Global as in reaches into other aspects of my life.
Yes. Yes.
Um, yeah, you know what? That's a really interesting question. Or was it kind of compartmentalized to that job? You know,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes when you go to your job, you feel like you put your work face on,
Mm-hmm.
or you kind of put a certain persona and you wear it on the stage of that work. But yeah, I think the biggest thing was it increased my enthusiasm. Just being around children, I'd say enthusiasm and agreeability would be the two
Mm-hmm.
personality traits
Mm-hmm.
that did like an overall elevation as the result of me being in that environment.
Yeah, and so we could think about it as you kind of integrated these more, and I'm thinking about your opposite example, where a woman has to maybe find her fierceness or her strength or her aggression or assertiveness. And again, hopefully, what happens is through being kind of forced to by environmental demands give expression to these, they become more conscious. You develop more of a relationship with them. They become more integrated, and then I think that we're actually talking about what Jung called individuation.
Mm.
So Jung said that individuation was this lifelong process of becoming whole. And when most of the time, we get to adulthood and we've got certain scripts about how we handle things. And we don't really think about it very much. We just have these kinds of set ways that we manage conflict, express emotion, experience happiness. We have our scripts. And that's fine, except that, sometimes the scripts aren't really adequate to allow us to live fully.
Hmm.
So, over the course of adulthood, if we're doing some psychological work, and you don't have to be an analysis to do that, you can just simply, be sort of introspective and open. But what will happen is we'll integrate different things, and that will expand our menu, our repertoire of behavioral and emotional responses to a given, uh, you know, input.
Hmm.
So, for example, if you're the woman who has been, again, quote, traditionally female, and you haven't worked in that corporate law firm,
Hmm.
you might be used to dealing with conflict by avoiding it. And I'm just going to use myself here. Maybe conflict comes up and you're just like, oh, I'm out of here. But then once you've had to get to know your animus better and you've integrated that and you've worked at that corporate law firm or you've had another experience that's called that out of you,
Hmm.
then maybe you're like, okay, now some conflict comes up. I can choose to avoid it. Maybe that's the right thing to do. Sometimes avoiding conflict is a good thing. Or I can choose to meet it head on because sometimes that's the right thing. So we have more choices, and we can then be more conscious about uh, how we react to things.
Hmm.
And for me, that's one way to think about individuation: is that we have our reactions are more choiceful
Hmm.
rather than just kind of driven by old scripts.
Yeah. Yeah. When two, say, individuated people come together into a relationship, whether it be a heterosexual relationship between a man and a woman, or any relationship where the masculine and feminine binary is expressed, um, how so? Say a man becomes into a partnership with a woman, is his anima, would it decrease with the presence of the woman? Like, would a man kind of unload some of his feminine qualities into the woman, and the woman kind of unloads or kind of transfers her masculine qualities onto the man. So they both become either more masculine or more feminine in the relationship because they have the other to reflect that opposing polarity.
Well, first of all, I mean, I think your question opens up a big and very interesting area. So, first of all, oftentimes when we fall in love, what we're doing is we're projecting the anima or the animus on the other person.
Mm.
And so, men will often project anima, especially young men will project anima on a woman. And, she'll just seem, magical and incredibly entrancing. And that's that quality. Oh, I've projected something of my own soul onto the other person. And it feels very, very deep. Now, I think the situation that you're describing where two people come together and then sort of allow the other person to carry that for them
Yeah.
is not a very psychologically evolved partnership, because
Mm.
you're allowing the other person to carry a significant part of your consciousness for you.
Mm.
Ideally, what happens is we fall in love with each other because we're projecting this thing on the other person. We're drawn together. We're certain that the other person holds the key to happiness. We come together and we realize, oh, he leaves his dirty socks on the floor. And so that projection of everything that is magical and divine begins to slowly be withdrawn. So
Mm.
the in love phase is sometimes referred to as limerence, and that would be the phase in which we're projecting ourselves onto the other person, or this aspect of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And then as that goes away, hopefully it's a real psychological piece of work to take back the projection and still see a person whom you love.
Mm-hmm.
But no longer does the person have the magical glow, because the person's no longer carrying the projection of our own soul.
Mm. So, is the anima or animus, is it safe to say that it is the ideal image of the opposite gender inside the mind?
It can be. It can be. Yeah, it's certainly. I'm trying to think of some examples. Well, for example, if you're a Renaissance poetry buff, maybe you're familiar with Dante and his
Mm-hmm.
Beatrice.
Mm.
So he didn't, Beatrice was, they think, I believe it was a real woman, but as far as they know, Dante never actually met her. But she was an image of his soul for him. And, he wrote her beautiful poems, and, in the, she's the one who is his guide through heaven, in his work. She doesn't go down to hell with him because that wouldn't be suitable. In the Divine Comedy. Another version of the anima would be the H. Rider Haggard novel from the 20th century called simply She. So this image of this all-powerful divine female.
Mm.
And again, this is how it shows up in the psyche of a man. So it can
Yeah.
show up as really, as you're saying, really idealized, sort of the
Mm-hmm.
perfect woman. Marilyn Monroe could be
Yeah.
considered an anima image.
Yeah.
But it might be, depending on what the nature of your relationship with the opposite sex parent, it might be something darker. I mean, I'm thinking, I've done some writing about the Brontes, and it's my hypothesis that at least Emily and Charlotte had very negative animus.
Mm-hmm.
And, Emily's negative animus shows up in the figure of Heathcliff, this kind of diabolical but compelling character. And
Mm-hmm.
in fact, there's some evidence that their father was pretty, I don't want to be unfair to him, but I think we have the data to say that he was sometimes a difficult guy. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And Charlotte, if you think about Rochester as her animus, Rochester's kind of a jerk.
Hmm.
I don't know if you've read Jane Eyre recently, but he really doesn't treat her very well at all.
Yeah.
And then he kind of gets changed over the course of the novel.
Hmm.
So the image of the animus kind of transforms.
Yeah, so there is the Anima Anonymous do kind of go through this developmental process, and I, I
Yes.
I can't think of all of the stages right now, but I know that the Animus there, the first stage is like Tarzan, and the fourth stage is Hermes, uh,
Mhm.
and that in the Anima, the first stage is Eve, and the final stage is Sophia,
That's
the
right.
kind of a refinement of the
Yes.
feminine energy. So how can one kind of work with these energies and develop themselves or work on themselves with being conscious of the anima or animus, and that there is a refinement process that this feminine or masculine energy inside of us can go through?
Yeah. Well, it's important to remember that these energies are autonomous.
Mm,
So we don't have control over them. Jung
yeah.
came up with this idea of the anima because he was doing some imaginal work, and he found that there was this voice in him that was really quite insistent about things, and it really didn't feel like it was him. And by the way, she didn't always seem very helpful. It's not like it's this like lovely angel on your shoulder.
Yeah.
She was kind of leading him astray. And he recognized this as this autonomous part of his psyche. So you might fall in love with someone, let's say, and then the two of you get married and you withdraw the projection, and your husband is no longer so much the carrier of your animus. That's very nice. You have a solid relationship. And then the animus is going to kind of go somewhere else. Maybe he's going to draw you out to begin some new intellectual or creative pursuit.
Mm,
And you're going to feel compelled by that. Maybe down the road, you're going to fall in love with someone outside the marriage. And there he is again. The Anima Anonymous bring this life energy. There's always this juiciness when they're around. They draw you out into life. They also draw you into the inner world.
mm,
And it always has a kind of compelling quality, and it always feels kind of other. So you're never going to fully integrate this, and it's never going to feel like, oh yes, that's simply my anima. You're going to feel compelled in new directions. I think that you can try to remember that this is a psychological experience. So let's say you've been married 20 years, and then suddenly you find yourself in love and thinking, oh, maybe I need to leave my marriage and run off with her.
mm,
And it's like, well, maybe, but let's first hold this psychologically and wondering what's going on. Something in you, your anima, is calling you on to some new development. So something is wanted of you. Your
mm,
soul is asking something of you. But you have to remember that it might not be asking of you what you at first glance think it's asking of you.
mhm,
It's asking you to leave your husband and run away, or leave your wife and run away. But nah, maybe that's not actually what you need to do in order to have this growth and maturation process. So
mhm.
in some sense, I think I'm answering your question by just saying you're going to have to remain in relationship with this energy, and sometimes it's going to give you a run for your money. It's not always comfortable.
Yeah, sometimes it seems like it is the generator of fantasy.
Yeah.
And just because you're fantasizing something doesn't mean you necessarily want to run full speed ahead at it.
Well, I really like that. The generator of fantasy. I'm not sure I've ever thought about it that way before, but I think that that is absolutely 100% true. Huh, that's really, yeah. So the generator of fantasy, and what I would say about that is fantasy always has a life giving aspect to it.
Mm,
And so we don't want to dismiss our fantasies and say, well, that's just a fantasy.
mhm,
But we need to be careful that we make this distinction between um, what Marie-Louise von Franz called the life-giving aspect of the fantasy and the desire to concretize it or realize it in just that form. So
Mm.
if you are having a fantasy about having an affair with this new, partner in the law firm that you work at or whatever, it's like, yeah, you can have very rich fantasies about what it might be like to be with her and what the two of you are going to do and what it's going to be like to take her to Paris or whatever. But then ask yourself, what is my soul asking of me?
Mm-hmm.
My soul is asking something of me. Maybe it's that I've gotten just everything has become very routine and I'm no longer attending to my own soul. Maybe I'm not attending to the soul of my marriage.
Mm.
Everything's become very surface and very staid. Maybe I need to look into my own heart and discover uh, what, where those stirrings of poetry went from when I was a young man. Maybe I need
Mm-hmm.
to reinvigorate my life by reinvesting in an interest I let languish many years ago. Maybe I need
Mm-hmm.
to pick back up my guitar or investigate my spirituality. But it may not necessarily be that I need to leave my marriage and run off to Paris with the new partner.
Interesting. So, in that sense, the fantasy or the anima or animus projection is kind of like a symptom of a larger
Yes.
issue that you
Yeah.
can read into, and that brings me to my next question, which is, could you tell us more about how the concept of anima and animus has helped you in your dream interpretation
Mm.
practice?
hmm Well, first, I want to speak to this idea about a sort of a symptom, and I think that that's really good. Jung said that the psyche is a self-regulating symptom. I'm sorry, system.
Mm-hmm.
So the sense is that when we get out of balance, something is going to happen to make us get back into balance. So if you are that, lawyer who's been, diligently working day in, day out, going into the firm, and you've sort of left behind your soul, yeah, you might find yourself just besotted with someone as your psyche's way of kind of kicking you in the butt and saying, you know what, it's time that you start paying attention to me again. And this would be a way that the psyche is righting the ship, that it's putting things back in balance. So that's a lovely point to bring up.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of dream interpretation, I mean, this is one of the places where I find this concept is really one of the most useful and why it's difficult for me to jettison it in spite of its sort of difficulties given our more modern ways of thinking about sex. Um, like I said earlier, the psyche really does seem to think in terms of these images, and should we really be surprised? So, when you're interpreting a dream from a Jungian standpoint, you assume that every aspect of the dream is some part of the dreamer's psyche. So every person in the dream, every mood, every event, these are all things that are happening in the inner world. And relationships in the dream portray relationships within the psyche.
Mm.
So if you dream about your third grade classmate, it's not about the third grade classmate. It's about some aspect of you, and your dream maker decided to clothe that aspect of you in the
Mm.
guise of your third grade classmate. There's some exceptions to this. Sometimes if you dream about someone who's in your everyday life, like your spouse or your boss, the dream might be commenting very directly on the dynamics in the relationship with that actual outer person. But in general, we make the assumption that it's all subjective.
Mhm.
So, if there is an important opposite sex figure in the dream, I don't know. Let's say that you have a dream that you go out to dinner, and while you're at dinner, marauding band of hoodlums comes into the restaurant and starts taking people hostage.
Mhm.
So, who'd you go to dinner with? Well, you went to dinner with a man. you're a woman having this dream. You went to dinner with a man. Okay, so my first thought is going to be, okay, so how might that be an image of Animus? Now, sometimes that doesn't really work. Sometimes it doesn't add much. Sometimes it doesn't tell me anything. But a good bit of the time, that's a really helpful place to start. And it will say, okay, so this is this masculine energy in your life that is saying something about how you relate to the inner world, or where your kind of masculine energy is and how you're relating to it.
Mm-hmm.
So it doesn't serve to be dogmatic about it or to be formulaic, but it's something to try, and it often is helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's Jung's greatest contribution really is to just give us what is, in the very least, a framework, kind of like a lens for understanding all these aspects of the psyche, and to kind of utilize them when they seem fitting, and maybe kind of change the lens a little bit when they don't apply so much.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. I mean, he was very clear, you need to have a theory, but when you're sitting in front of the other person, all the theory should sort of go out the window, and you just are there with the dream. And, he says, a lot of times I just say to myself, when I hear a dream, I have no idea what that dream means.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
it doesn't serve to make it a kind of doctrinaire exercise. Well, the opposite sex figure is the animus, and the same sex figure is the shadow, and it's always like this. But it's sort of like, okay, moving around this, and dreams are so slippery, and they're so confusing, and they're so multi-layered. Where can I start poking at this?
Yeah. Yeah. And humans are so wonderfully complicated,
They sure are.
Yeah. Well, Lisa, I think that's a great place to wrap it up. And can you tell our audience a little bit about any kind of stuff you have that you'd like to promote, or where people can find you?
Sure. Well, I have a book coming out next month. It's called Motherhood, Facing and Finding Yourself, and it's being published by Sounds True. And it uses myths, dreams, fairy tales, clinical anecdotes, personal stories, movies to explore how being a mother can be a catalyst for tremendous personal growth on the part of the mother. And of course, there's This Jungian Life. We have the podcast, comes out every Thursday. And we also have Dream School, which is a 12-month program that you can enroll in to learn how to work with your dreams. So if you're interested in more in my book, you can find more about that at lisamarchiano.com. The podcast website is thisjungianlife.com, and you can read more about Dream School at the podcast website.
Wonderful. Lisa, thank you so much for coming onto the CoSM Podcast. It was an honor to speak with you.
Oh, it was great to be here. Thanks so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks again for listening to the CoSM Podcast. Be sure to check out Lisa's new book, Motherhood, available now. Her podcast, This Jungian Life, is a great introduction to Carl Jung's ideas and how they apply to the modern day. I highly recommend it. Follow the links located in the description of this video. And collect fine art and literature by Alex Gray and Allison Gray when you visit shop.cosm.org. All proceeds go towards the building of Entheon, Sanctuary of Visionary Art. Much love, and see you next time.